So unlike some of your other guests, I'm not really as much of a themed entertainment person. I'm really an information professional that somehow got obsessed with Disneyland. When I was doing the documentation of the new Tomorrowland construction, I was 15, 16. Maybe I liked how much it changed and it had a history. Like when the Nickel Tour came out, that was right at the time in 1995. That was right at the time that we were visiting a little more frequently. And it was like, oh, it had all these other attractions I never knew about. And it was also at that time learning about the Walt Disney Archives that maybe want to become an archivist, because before then I didn't know that there was a role where you just deal with, the primary source historical documents. Like, wow, sign me up.
That is Jason Schultz. He's here to talk about his work putting together a massive digital archive of Disneyland. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 199 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. We are one episode away from 200. I can't really believe it, and I'm super pumped about this episode where we focus on ways to document the history of Disneyland with archivist Jason Schultz, who has brought his skills from his career to his work creating the Parkendium, which is a digital archive of Disneyland with more than 70,000 photos from every era of the park's history. He's still working on a Disneyland thesaurus. And what I found so interesting too is that I'm so used to approaching the parks myself and looking mostly at the rides, a little bit at the shows, but a lot of it at the rides and what they've added and what used to be there and what's there now. And Jason approaches it very differently as someone who's super interested in Disneyland. It's not that he dislikes the rides, but that is not his primary focus. It's looking at the park on the whole and documents and where it's been and where it is now. And I find that so interesting as someone who approaches it differently. But Jason has a really cool point of view, and the work he's doing is very important and something that I highly suggest that you check out. And we dive into Jason's background, his interest in Disneyland, the work he does, and so much more. It was awesome to get the chance to talk to Jason, so let's get right to it. Here is Jason Schultz.
Hi, Dan. I'm excited to be here and to talk about Disneyland historiography and archive building.
Yes. I think it's going to be fun because I feel like what you're trying to do is a great undertaking. And there's so much history, given the fact that Disneyland, is approaching nearly 70 years. It's coming fast. So it's really exciting. But, I'd love to ask you up front, too. I mean, this is a massive undertaking already, what you have, 70,000 plus photos and other items. So I'd love to know what inspired you initially to decide that this is something you really wanted to focus on, like as a project.
So the digital archive, I've kind of been building piecemeal over 15 to 25 years, depending on how you look at it. But the archive isn't my main project. Actually, my main thing is my Disneyland thesaurus, which is kind of the index language that will describe the archive. But because nobody had built a digital Disneyland archive for me to index, I had to first build that to then continue my thesaurus work and then be able to link out to these things. I'm sure we'll get into my background with Disneyland growing up, but kind of the origins of the project were, as a teenager, I wanted to create the ultimate Disneyland reference work, which at that time I envisioned as a series of encyclopedias. And then after library school, kind of changed what I thought about it. And then during the pandemic, when I started to digitize more materials, that the archive came into a more defined state.
Well, you mentioned the thesaurus. That's a good good. I'm curious about that because I feel like, that led to this, and that's such a big project. So even ahead of the archive, how did that come together with working to create this thesaurus with multiple volumes and everything else?
So for your listeners, I'm speaking of a thesaurus in the library science sense that defines concepts and then expresses the relationships between them, including hierarchical and associative relationships. And so I took an index language construction class in library science school with a friend, and we were to come up with 50 to 60, we need to have a topic and then come up with 50 to 60 terms to show some organizational complexity. And we couldn't agree on something, so we just defaulted to Disneyland, and we had about 4,000 terms in for the class project. And so then I just started building on that, filling the thesaurus in with all of the facts and details from all these various publications that I had access to.
What were some of the publications that really helped you at that point? Because I know things have changed a lot just given the nature of the internet even since then. But at the time, what were some of your big sources you used?
So one of the first things I learned in library school, I think the title of the article was Truth in Bibliography. So, this is a big project in ingesting a lot of information. And so I had to create kind of documents that, first of all, defined the universe of information. And then when I used the sources, so I would know myself what was in there and what was still outstanding. The Disneyland line, the e-ticket, books like the Nickel Tour, newspaper articles. I've saved over 20,000 newspaper articles from the LA Times and the Register and various other sources. Any authoritative source I'm happy to include information from.
So you mentioned during the pandemic too that you started really focusing on, this Parkendium, this digital archive. So, how much time did you spend on that? And really, how did you go about developing what you were going to put into that in terms of the photos and things you had in there?
What kind of got me started was, sitting at home next to piles of stuff. And I wanted to digitize my family slides, like we have about 4,500 slides. And we have a flatbed scanner that was really, really slow, and I thought was good enough. But then I got into learning more about camera scanning, or use a camera to photograph the negatives and the slides. And I built a system and was really happy with it. And then I started to digitize. I first of all redigitized about 2,700 of my own Disneyland photos from the 90s because I was never happy with how I digitized them 20 years ago. And then I digitized several thousand photos from my friend Joe Guajardo. And then another 4,500 photos from my friend Dean, who I worked with in Disneyland Guest Relations. And I'm working on digitizing more for my friend Doug Marsh. So it's I'm 41 years old and I feel old. And it's great because I built up these relationships over, decades. And so they trust me to borrow their materials and to digitize them and then to share them. And so that's kind of a really rewarding part of all this, is leveraging those personal relationships to be able to preserve and to make this accessible.
Well, yeah, because people, they know that if they pass something along, you're not, you have positive aims and you're going to do something good with them. Because I've even noticed, like, seeing you just on social media and everything, that you'll be out there presenting, and a lot of even, historical people or former Imagineers will jump in a discussion. So, how's that been for you? Just connecting with, whether it's people that are well known or not well known, but just people that have so much history and know a lot of the parks.
Yeah, so kind of with my archive and with my thesaurus work, I'm really a Disneyland history generalist. So, there are people who know every square inch of the Haunted Mansion, and I'm not one of them. And so it's really fun to be able to connect with people who know more specific things. And even if they're not a Disneyland expert, they could absolutely know things that I don't know and be able to share with us. And so, it's great to hear from Imagineers. Like just last night, I had posted about the Atlantean Encounter poster that Josh Shipley designed and the everything that went on with that. And I learned something new 25 years later.
That's that sign that you posted there that they had put up. Just what an interesting time that was in terms of the 90s-ish, around, not just right then, but even as it rolled into the 2000s and everything else. So just just a weird time. But I'd love to know more about, we haven't mentioned it yet, but you referenced it, your interest in Disneyland. So, I mean, when you were growing up, you mentioned going a lot in the 90s. I spent a lot more time at Disney World just being in Missouri. But you be getting the chance to, take that many photos at a time when people didn't take as many photos. I mean, you must have been just interested from the start. So how did that start?
So growing up in Orange County, we would go, a couple of times a year. And then in 1994, when I was 12, we got annual passes. And so then it was maybe once or twice a month. And then it became a little more frequent. And then my sophomore year of high school, I went 126 times during the school year. And so that was when the new Tomorrowland construction was going on. So that's how I was able to be there so often, was just living in Orange County and not having anything else I wanted to do than go to Disneyland. And then when I was at home, I'd be on the Disneyland news group and talking about it. And then I worked in Disneyland guest relations when I was in college. So I started on November 18th, 2000, on Mickey's birthday. And I helped to be part of the team that opened Disney's California Adventure and the expanded Disneyland Resort. That's why I was able to hire directly into guest relations, because at the time they were hiring from the outside because they needed so many people. So that was challenging at times, especially on the Disney California Adventure side, which charged the same price as Disneyland, but didn't offer quite the same experience, especially if you had kids. And I worked there until July 17th of 2003. So I started on a significant anniversary and decided to go out on one as well. And then I actually kind of lost interest in Disneyland for a few years. I didn't really visit or do any historical research. And then it was really as a result of that library science class and building the thesaurus, I was like, now I have the tools to kind of to make this Disneyland reference work in a way I didn't even know was possible before. And then I moved. So I went to the University of Maryland for library science and history degrees, graduate degrees. And then I moved back to California in 2010, got an annual pass, visited frequently again, and then lost interest in Disneyland again. And so there were several years where I wasn't working on the thesaurus. So it's kind of gone off and on. Right now, it's really on for the past few years, and especially being able to have a product that other people can see and where I've been able to utilize it. Like, it's one of the things I do to test the effectiveness of my indexing is when I see things on Twitter, like somebody posts about something and wants to know, when was this put in, or when did it used to look like this, seeing how quickly I could find something in the collection of stuff that I have, which is not only my own photos, but, the photos from the vintage blogs, which are so important to Disneyland history. That's a really, really important piece, actually, are those vintage blogs, because when I was wanting to do this comprehensive Disneyland work, not being inside the company, like, I didn't have photos of 1950s and 1960s Disneyland that weren't published in the Nickel Tour or something. And so it was in the course of researching for the thesaurus that I found, like, I think I typed in like Cole of California swimsuits, and like a photo of it popped up, and it's like, why does somebody have that? And why is it on the internet? And so it was really important that those sites have shared so many things. And to give you an example of the concrete way that is, there's really only a few big sites. There's Stuff from the Park, there's Gorillas Don't Blog, and Daveland Blog that are responsible for so many of those vintage images being shared. And mostly they were vintage collectors. And so you see stuff from the 50s. And I don't think people were taking fewer pictures necessarily. They weren't taking slides as much. And so those haven't gotten out there in the same way. And so that's why I appreciate the collection that I took for myself 25 years ago, and that other friends who were visitors in the 80s and 90s have allowed me to digitize their negatives, because those are, they're rare only in the sense that they're not online, I think.
Well, right, because, those sites are so great. Especially the one that Gorillas Don't Blog, I've spent, not as much lately, but for a while was spending so much time going through there, because, again, they had that early look, but like you said, if I think about it, if a lot of that, because I remember going in 1985, I was 9 years old. So I went, and Adventures to Inner Space was still there, and America Sings and some of that. And that era, not the 60s when Inner Space opened, but that era near the pre Captain EO, Star Tours, all that, is kind of an interesting era because even like, the attendance wasn't huge. It wasn't like, there was kind of this weird in between of the initial push and then and Disney movies weren't doing as well. So that's an interesting time that I'm glad you get to document because, again, especially in the 1970s, I feel like late 70s, I don't see a lot of photos because you're used to seeing, here's when Pirates open, and then here's Haunted Mansion and everything else. And then you see, here's some of the things like Star Tours and other things. But what about that stretch between it is kind of an interesting time.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll see it in the Vintage Disneyland Facebook group. But again, usually people are posting either scans of print photographs that have faded, or they're taking an iPhone photo of that faded print and then posting it, kind of low resolution. So it's working with the originals and being able to zoom in and see every film grain is kind of nice to be able to see the details in the background.
Well, I have to ask you, you said you were in guest relations when DCA opened and you referenced it a little bit. I'm sure people weren't super happy. Like, has that been, because, you hear now that like people were just so mad. Has that been over heightened, or were people that angry coming to guest relations?
Oh yeah, they were not happy. I can't remember if it was a July 4th or July 5th, but it was in early July of 2001. I had been City Hall trained about 3 or 4 weeks earlier. That was one of the last places you'd be trained after working other information locations because the stakes are lower there. And so with City Hall and the guest relations lobby, sometimes you have conflicts because you have people who are angry and you have to figure out the appropriate way to compensate them that takes care of their problem at the appropriate level. So I was City Hall trained like 3 or 4 weeks before this shift, but I hadn't gotten any City Hall shifts. So my training had all gone out the window. So I came into work and I thought I had a City Hall shift, and I came there and they said, "Oh no, you're actually at the lobby." And I went to the lobby and there were like 3 or 4 guest relations cast members and I think 2 managers and a line out the door. This was at noon. And one manager saw me and said, "Oh, Jason, no, you're not Hall trained." And then I was like, "Oh, great, I can get out of this." But I copped to the fact that yes, I was trained, and that was a day where I literally did not have any breaks from guests except for my actual breaks because they were upset at how crowded it was and how it wasn't Disneyland. There were some guests who would enter and immediately come to us because they're like, "Oh, we entered the wrong park." Those ones are easy to fix.
It's over there.
And I think it was this shift. There was a guest who came to me. They were there on they had something at the convention center. That's why they were in town. And they said they only wanted to see the tortilla factory and it was closed, and they wanted, a ticket to come back another day or the refund or something. And I did whatever it was. And it was later I heard at a party that the tortilla factory actually had closed because an employee had lost part of a finger in one of the machines.
Yeah, I guess that's a good reason. I don't know, and people need to see the factory though. I mean, come on. Well, I want to circle back. You mentioned that you got so into Disneyland in the 90s and everything. Like, what was it like about Disneyland that attracted you so much that made you become someone who went 100 plus times at that point? And it's a silly question because Disneyland's great, but I'm curious for you, what was the draw?
So unlike some of your other guests, I'm not really as much of a themed entertainment person. I'm really an information professional that somehow got obsessed with Disneyland. When I was doing the documentation of the new Tomorrowland construction, I was 15, 16. Maybe I liked how much it changed and it had a history. Like when the Nickel Tour came out, that was right at the time in 1995. That was right at the time that we were visiting a little more frequently. And it was like, oh, it had all these other attractions I never knew about. And it was also at that time learning about the Walt Disney Archives that maybe want to become an archivist, because before then I didn't know that there was a role where you just deal with, the primary source historical documents. Like, wow, sign me up. So I don't know exactly what it was other than it being, just a really neat place to go to and having the fabulous opportunity to visit so much and to meet some of the Imagineers. Like I met Tony several times in that period and became friends with Bruce Gordon. But then it all kind of been like, it all came together really nicely.
Well, excellent. Well, you mentioned your professional side. I mean, I'm curious, what interested you, or how did you get involved with that kind of as your career? And you mentioned going to library science classes and everything else, but because that seems to be that played a big role in what you're doing. It's connected directly to what you do as a job.
As I said, I always knew I wanted to be an archivist. So I got a bachelor's degree in history. And then a well-known historian, Mike Davis, I took a class with him, and I was talking about, what I should do for graduate school. And he suggested getting both a master's in history and a master's in library science. And so I went to the University of Maryland because I knew there'd be a lot of internship opportunities in that area. And I got my love for history, I think, growing up, going to Colonial Williamsburg in Washington, D.C., like every couple of years. And so I got a student job with the National Archives. And then I also did internships with the National Historic Landmark Survey, with the National Geographic Society, and with the National Agricultural Library. And I bounced around a few places at the National Archives as a student before I became an archivist with the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. And I helped to move presidential materials from Maryland to California. And then I moved back with them in 2010. And so it was kind of I just happened to fall into a job that, moved me back to Orange County, and then had a permanent job too. And so archival jobs can be hard to come by, but I felt pretty fortunate in how things worked out for me.
Yeah, it sounds that way. Did you ever, you mentioned the Walt Disney Archives, which, I know that's a very small amount of people, I believe, or at least it was. Is that something you've ever been interested in working at or being involved with more directly?
So again, I'm really interested in Disneyland. And
right.
So like all of the other things that the Walt Disney Company does and the Walt Disney Archives, doesn't speak to me as much. So like my dream internal Disney job would be like a digital Disneyland archivist. And so I kind of just built my own archives on the outside to have my toy to play with.
That makes sense. Yeah. Because even me, people are like, oh, you're into all things with Disney. I'm like, yeah, I've seen most of the movies because, with my daughters and stuff, but it's more about the parks. So there's all these different areas that people might be interested in, which I know for you is Disneyland. Like, are there certain parts, like you already referenced you were focused at the time on the new Tomorrowland and the timing, that people don't have as much, but are there eras of history that from Disneyland that you find particularly interesting, or like that really, when you get something from that era, or even a certain attraction or land that you really enjoy?
Well, as a generalist, you asked me to pick favorites, and I don't know if I could do that.
Well, it's a podcast, we got to put down.
Anything from the early years is super interesting because they're really trying to figure it out. And so there are little details that you can see like in the background of photos, and it's like that might have only been there for a few weeks or something. And so there's always more to discover about really any of the eras. But the early years are just really super interesting because of how new it was to everyone before it had a chance to settle in.
Yeah, especially like you referenced Tomorrowland. Like I still am kind of like, really? That's what they had in the first few years? It's crazy some of the things they had that really aren't documented that well beyond, like you said, some of the sites and what you've done. Tomorrowland, just because like Fantasyland, I know they redid a lot of the rides, but you still, when you started, you had a Peter Pan and a Mr. Toad and everything. So you're kind of like, okay, I can kind of see what that was. But Tomorrowland, it's like, it feels like it was the Wild West until at least until the updates in the 60s.
Yeah, I would say the new Tomorrowland of 1967, things pertaining to that, like photos of that when it's new and in its prime, and especially the People Mover, that kind of stuff is neat. It's also really interesting when I come across like internal documentation that's now on the outside. So like my friend Patrick Jenkins, who I can't say enough good things about as a collector and sharer, he's the one who ran the Stuff from the Park blog. And I'm now sort of systematically digitizing from his collection, both photographs and documents. And he has just so much stuff beyond Disney. I'm not going to touch that, but digitizing his Disney stuff. But he's purchased like some signage documentation photos from the 50s that are in the 1966 that are up on Parkendium. And they're just really neat because they're these, small details that people wouldn't really be taking photos of. And it's so comprehensive and and wide ranging.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's like, because when people were only taking such a small amount of photos, you probably see a lot of photos of the same things. At least I suspect that's the issue with, I mean, not as much because he's already done some of the work, but I'm sure for him is you have a lot of people, like even now, everybody takes a photo in front of the castle, but now people take tons of them, where then it was a smaller amount, I suspect.
So the Parkendium Public Archive has, my photos and photos from friends and people who have allowed me to do it. And I'll have more guest collateral like guide maps as I get it digitized and processed. But I've also scraped a large amount of material from Flickr and Twitter that if I had a system and I'm building an index language that references them, I don't really want to rehost them. So if I could figure out a system where you could use the index language and then it would link you out to the original, I'd feel comfortable sharing it with everyone. But I've done a lot of descriptive work on these, probably close to 900,000 to 1 million photos.
Oh, wow.
And so from Twitter alone, there were 250,000 that I've saved. And I have about 13,000 that I've tagged as castle portraits, which are the type of pictures you would expect of people posing with the castle in the background. And so the ones from Twitter are really interesting because they provide a perspective from, tens of thousands of different people, how they enjoy Disneyland and Disney's California Adventure and what they, put out there for social media. And so it offers a window into the Disneyland visitor experience that you don't get from a couple of photographers or collecting, some random vintage shots.
That makes sense. My parents have uncovered some older photos, and I'm always amazed what they focused on taking, or even videotaping. I'm like, why? Why did you focus on that? So it's weird, I'm sure, that people focus on different things. And that raises a good question, though, because a lot of people, when they're looking back, are really focused, like you said, on the early years. But it sounds like you're still interested in what people are taking photos of now. Does that still interest you? Because that's a lot. I think a lot of people think of, oh, we're doing an archive, we want to just look at the first 20 years or something.
Yeah. So today will be history. And so it's never going to look exactly the same again. I view the pictures that I'm taking when I visit the park, like I'm going to the park tomorrow, I'll be taking some pictures. I've used those as like a gift to myself in 30 years to show what it looks like. There were periods where I was taking a lot of pictures from 96 until early 2000 or so. And then I just wasn't taking as many. And now it's like the early 2000s are kind of like a black hole for me because I only have, a really small number. Yeah, that's another gap that I'm looking to fill. And I've been talking to my friend Rebecca Mosley of Laughing Place because they have their digital, small file sizes, but they're still better than nothing. And they did good coverage of Disneyland in the late 90s and early 2000s that I'm anxious to see. But my project, so going back to the thesaurus, you've heard of Roget's thesaurus, I assume, the most famous thesaurus there is. So Peter Mark Roget, he started writing that, collecting information when he was in his early to mid 20s, and he didn't publish it until he was 73. And after I'd been working on my thesaurus for a couple of years, I discovered that he and I had the same birthday, which is International Thesaurus Day. And would you care to guess what happens on the year that I turned 73? Pertaining to Disneyland.
Is that when you're going to release your Disneyland thesaurus? Because you're preempting my next question, so you're on it. But is that when you're going to release it?
So in my 73rd year, Disneyland will turn 100.
Oh,
so
that's better.
I kind of regard my scope as Disneyland's first 100 years, and maybe at that point, if I'm still around to be able to do so, to be able to pass it off to a next generation for the second 100 years. And it also kind of ties in a little bit with the Nickel Tour because, at the end of that book, they have like a little postcard of what could be released on Disneyland's 100th birthday. And since it was such a foundational book for me and learning to appreciate Disneyland history and knowing Bruce and David, that seemed appropriate to focus on the first 100 years.
I like it. Yeah. And also I think about for a while they had that 2055 Tomorrowland that they were going to do. So there's a lot of stuff for that year, I mean, it didn't really happen completely, but yeah, I'm excited. I hope that I'm still around to see your thesaurus, I'm a little older, 6 years older, but I think I've got a chance of being there for it.
I want to have it online and accessible before then. That's just kind of I tell myself, because it is a really big project, like this undertaking, and I am only one person kind of putting all this together, having another 32 years, I can, let a thing or two slide. Like, I haven't done Gorillas Don't Blog photos from 2022 yet. I'll get on that next month.
Yeah. So, I mean, hey, I appreciate the fact that you're spending so much time on it. I mean, because when I see something like this, I'm like, this could easily be, and I know it's not, but could easily be a full-time project. Like, you could spend every day on this. But I mean, how much time are you typically spending, like maybe in a week or a month, on this project right now?
I don't think I want to track that.
You don't have to. I promise you, I'm not asking you to do a time study or anything. It's a rough estimate. Don't worry about that. Just in general. You can also take the fifth.
I work on it pretty much every day, and although I'll be doing other things on the internet, sometimes I'll be scanning while I'm on social media, or I'll be kind of trying to multitask. I've learned a lot of efficiencies, in doing this work for years now. Like, okay, I need to learn how to automate, this process. So a lot of things related to like the metadata and the scraping. Like initially I was saving photos from Flickr like one by one before I realized that there was a tool I could use to do it, much, much better. And also, I'm not a huge fan of the Chat GPT, but I have used it to help me write Python scripts to scrape some things from websites that otherwise I wouldn't have had the knowledge to do. So that's one point in its favor.
Well, that's good. I haven't heard that many. I mean, there's a few points in its favor, but yeah, that's one that I personally think is got to be helpful, because that's what I'm picturing it from my limited technological perspective of like, how would I get all these photos? Not thinking, of course, there are ways that you can do it much faster and more efficiently. So that's good to hear. It makes me feel better about the whole project, just for sanity's sake as much as anything. For you, but I think it's a great project for sure.
The scary thing about digital preservation is that nothing is ever preserved. It's just in the state of being preserved. And so thinking about the future, like 32 years from now at Disneyland's 100th birthday, what's it going to look like? Where's it going to live? Who's going to have, control over it? Those are all things that I need to define better. But again, I have 32 years where I'm hoping to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a good amount of time to figure that out. Because, I was curious, like I know in 32 years you want to have that, but in the near future, I mean, do you have some goals just I'm not talking about tomorrow, but just in the next few years that you really want to do or accomplish with this as you kind of look ahead?
Well, I'm helping Tom Morris and Chris Merritt with some of their research, and Brad Abbott is working on a book about the lessees that should be really good. So part of it is the public archive, trying to make sure that people know it exists and see if there are ways that it could be more interesting or useful to them, but also really working with the serious researchers to figure out what materials I have that would be useful to their research, and is it accessible in a way that is good for them. I would like to make some progress on getting more of the thesaurus information online. Because currently with the MediaGraph implementation, the keywords are there, but there's no information about them. So it's one thing if, okay, these are photographs of Bob Gurr, but if you live a sad life, you don't know who Bob Gurr is, it's very different if then you have, biographical information and lists of things that he worked on and all that sort of stuff to help people who aren't the Disney people like us understand what these things are, and then also help with the searching.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, Tom Morris, I've talked to both Chris and Tom. Tom, I know when I talked to him, this was several years ago, was really in the weeds about like his book on the early days of WED.
He's still in the weeds, yeah.
Yeah, he was very interested in figuring out where the office was, and we talked about that for a while, and I found it fascinating. But I hope he's able to get to the point where he can release it, because just the little bit I know, it sounds really interesting what he's working on so far.
Speaking of Bob and Chris and Tom, I have a fun story from the late 2000s. I was visiting California and having dinner at Bob's house with him and Chris. And Bob was telling, I don't remember why, but Bob was telling Chris that he needed to research in some specific files. And he was like describing the cabinet to him. And I didn't know from then if he had ever found it or what the result was. And then I was talking to Tom a few years ago, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm the one who helped Chris find that." And so I was like, "Oh, this all kind of wraps together nicely, doesn't it?"
Yeah. Well, I mean, Chris working on that book, the book about Mark Davis. Just such a great, for me, someone who's so interested in those rides. I mean, that was something. So getting the chance for you to connect and assist them, and of course, getting to meet Bob Gurr, which I have not done. Just jealous on that front, but I also am glad you're using what you've been able to research and everything to help those guys who are both so accomplished historians, but also Imagineers too.
Yeah, it's really fun to connect with people who are nerdy about Disneyland history in the same way, but they being Imagineers and older than me, they know things that I don't know. And so it's really great to be able to learn from them. But I'm sad that you've never met Bob Gurr, because he's been a friend of mine for 20 years and actually came to my college graduation back in 2004.
How did you connect originally with Bob?
It was through Laughing Place. They connected us because a friend and I had started tongue-in-cheek the Bruce Gordon fan club, and we had a few Bruce Gordon fan club dinners with him, but then we changed it in 2000 to the Imagineering fan club, and we wanted to interview people. And so we interviewed, I can't remember if we interviewed, I know we interviewed Doug Hartwell and Bruce Gordon and Bob Gurr. I can't remember the order, but that was one of the early ones. And then we didn't really stay in touch, I don't think. But I knew from visiting his house the first time that he was really interested in hiking. When spring break was upon me, I just contacted him and said, "Hey, do you want to go on a hike?" And so then we connected over that and ended up going on a few camping trips together, one of which was to Mineral King. He had never been up there before, although he had worked on the ski lift design. And we took a road trip along the San Andreas Fault, which was kind of neat. We had a couple books that pointed out where you could see various evidence of the fault and the plate movements. And then another trip in helping me to write my master's thesis was up and down the Sierra Nevada. We went up and went over each of the 7 passes, so I could experience that. So he's a great guy. He's everything that you would expect if he's just.
I've seen a lot of interviews. Yeah. And I feel like I know him. It's like, that's kind of how I felt about Rolly Crump. I never met him either, but there were so many interviews and so many things and books and whatnot that I'm like, I kind of feel like I know that guy, but I know I really don't. It's just, you only know the public side of it. So it's cool. It's cool with Bob that you've been able to hang out with him so much beyond that side of it.
So the thing about Bob that I take away is just as the prototypical, first generation Imagineer who is intensely curious about everything. He just asks a lot of questions. He retains a lot of knowledge. And he's just so inquisitive.
That doesn't surprise me, but that's cool to hear. And so, one thing we haven't really talked about at all is rides, which, that's interesting. Just so I'm curious, before I have some fun questions to close with, but I'm curious, before I start asking questions about rides, I know you're more interested in Disneyland as like an archivist as such, but is there enough where if I ask you about rides, you'll have some opinions? That's what I'm curious about. Are you a generalist on ride opinions?
So my most authentic way of experiencing Disneyland is just to go there and walk around like it's a park. And so if I go on an attraction, that might not be unusual. If I go on like 2 attractions, that might be unusual. My 6-year-old asked me a few months ago if I was just going to go there to ask questions and take pictures. And I was like, well, what else are you going to do there? So go ahead and ask your questions and we'll see if
this does raise a question though. So like you go there and just, what's like your favorite area to hang out in or walk around? That I'm just curious because that obviously you do a lot of that when you're there rather than as much of rides.
Not Tomorrowland. Let's get that out of the way.
That makes sense.
Frontierland in New Orleans Square. I think part of it's just because I have a nice camera now and I really like to take pictures of the Mark Twain. It's just such a beautiful boat and you have the distances. So you can get really different perspectives on things and you can ride on it. And, elevated perspectives at Disneyland have kind of been restricted over the years, kind of gone down in quantity. And so being up there on like the top deck of the Mark Twain is a bit of a difference. And it's just such nice trees. Yeah, I also really enjoy being around the Matterhorn. And the Matterhorn, I took a ride on the Matterhorn in the rain this winter, and I hadn't been on it in a while because I didn't really like the changes from 2012 with I'll call them the new bobsleds. But I just absolutely loved that. And then I was just appreciating how many different perspectives there are on seeing the Matterhorn, like from almost every land, from seeing it outside the park, from the parking structure. It's the only, attraction like it where you can walk around the entire thing to see everything. And it has, people screaming, and it has motion, and it has, the music. And so there's just a lot going on with the Matterhorn as a hub of activity for that corner of the park.
Yeah, I also used to love it when I only saw it once in person, but when the Skyway would go through the Matterhorn, because then you add in this another layer to what you just described. There's just so much going on, and that world on the move, but just the atmosphere is just so much fun. I think that's a great example, especially given that it kind of hovers in multiple lands in a way with Tomorrowland and with Fantasyland, and even you could see it well from Main Street too. So
yep,
excellent.
You certainly can.
I will adjust my questions, but I'm going to ask some of them. But I'm a professional, Jason, so I can come up with questions on the fly too. So just so
let's see what you got.
Yeah, it's going to be disappointing. I just got to tell you. Well, here's one that I had put together. So, I'm curious, regardless of, I know you don't go on a lot of rides, but, given your age and everything else, is there like a certain extinct attraction or a certain attraction that you never experience that is something, whether it's documenting it with photos or actually writing it, something that you really wish you could have seen in person?
It'd probably be something from the original Tomorrowland, just because those exhibit, like, the Richfield show, or experiencing the original Circle Vision film, A Tour of the West, with all those like Kelvinator appliances, like surrounding you, and the Nash Rambler on display. So I think just experiencing something that was unique to its time. I never saw like the Carousel of Progress at Disneyland, so that would be up there too.
But no, I think those are good examples. Yeah, because I always think about just the weirdness of the Bathroom of Tomorrow or the Aluminum Hall of Fame or some of those early Tomorrowland things where I'm like, yeah, I don't know if they'd be the most entertaining long term, but just they're so strange. And the post show of Carousel of Progress, which I never saw that at Disneyland either. Because like I said, the first time I went was America Sings. That interests me so much, given just, yes, it's still in Florida, but it was different then. And it wasn't the same as the World's Fair, but it was still something really cool that you got to see with that big Progress City model. That sounds super cool.
So I think I also would have really liked to experience Tomorrowland in 1977 when the Space Mountain Complex was new. And I was just talking about this with Chris Merritt, because not only do you have basically everything from the 1967 Tomorrowland, except America Sings instead of Carousel of Progress, but you have this huge new complex with a new, roller coaster. You have the Space Place restaurant. You have the open air stage. So, before it was converted to the Magic Eye Theater, people up on the Space Mountain concourse, whether they were waiting in line for Space Mountain or they got their food from the Space Place, or they were just up there, they could see, down. And then you have the Starcade. And so that's just like so much energy in that area, plus all the World on the Move stuff with the People Mover going by and the rocket jets spinning. That must have been really incredible. So like, I would love to see, like nighttime photos from the late 1970s and film, like high quality film, which, Disney may or may not have, because that would be something.
Oh yeah. Because I always think about the stuff from the 60s, but like you mentioned, they added even more to that and still had a lot of from then. And it's just, because when I was a kid, Tomorrowland at Disney World too was always just like my favorite place. But like you referenced, it's changed so much. But but thinking positively, there was just so much to like at that time. Well, Disney's added a lot of newer things. Even you mentioned, DCA is 20 plus years old. But I'm just curious, for you, like, is there an area that you enjoy more, whether it's, they've added Galaxy's Edge, Avengers Campus, Cars Land, all that. Is there a certain area that you're like, hey, this is pretty cool. Are you like photos of that? Or you're interested in something they've added more recently?
So I have this theory that people like fall in love with Disneyland at a certain age, and then things change, but that time when they fall in love with it, like that's their Disneyland, and anything that's different from that, any new things, like it doesn't have that same emotional connection. At least that's how it is for me. That like I know the 1990s Disneyland wasn't top tier Disneyland, but the parts of it that were kind of had been there since the 50s, some of which have changed today. There was still a lot of that, and so like I don't have the same connection to Disney's California Adventure. So like with the reservations, I'm always going to default to Disneyland versus DCA, and so I enjoy like taking pictures of it because I have this project, but I don't take pictures of it in the same way I do like the Mark Twain. Like I have enough pictures of the Mark Twain, but I still want to take more pictures of it.
I understand that. Yeah, because for me, it was going to Epcot when I was a kid, like in the late 80s. So now I still go and I'm like, oh, Spaceship Earth, which even though it's been there forever, it's still, or even the areas that are the same. And, I won't veer us off into what's happened with that park. But for me, it's like, it's always going to connect because it connected me when I was 10 or when I was 12 or whatever. So, and some people for that, it was the Disney MGM Studios. And probably for somebody, it's DCA right now. I don't know. But, I think that's a great point, though, is that it's never going to connect the same way as it does right now. Well, so I totally get that. Well, I only have one more question for you then. So you mentioned you might ride one ride or two rides if you're really, really stretching. Like, so if you're going to ride one ride, like, is there one at Disneyland that's the one you're going to find yourself riding the most beyond the Mark Twain? That's already been covered. But another ride that is something that you really enjoy, or even it could be a show or something else. Like what's something like for fun, separate from the project that you like to enjoy there?
Yeah, not really a show or a parade person. But really it would be the classics like the Disneyland Railroad or the Haunted Mansion or Pirates. When we visit with the kids, obviously we're going to go on some of the stuff in Fantasyland. A few weeks ago, I rope dropped and just happened to see that Mr. Toad didn't have a wait, so I went on that. So I enjoy the attractions in general. I don't like waiting, and often I visit by myself, and so I guess with a smartphone now you can mitigate the wait time, but also with Genie Plus and all that line garbage.
Only $25 a day.
Yeah, I'm not paying that.
No, and I'm not trying to give you trouble at attractions. I totally get it. So don't feel like I'm attacking. I'm just trying. I also don't want to just keep asking you questions like about attractions without taking into account, everybody approaches, I think especially with Disneyland, people approach it differently because especially if you're local, it's not the same as someone like me going and I'm like, okay, we've got 3 days or 4 days. I may not be back here in however many years. It's not that way for you. So it's a really different experience, which I think is great.
It's like, I'll be back Sunday. If I don't do this, I can do it then.
Can I wait 4 days? I don't know. It's a tough call. So yeah. Well, just summing it up, I think your project that you're working on is really awesome. And I'd love, if people want to find out more about, or they can connect with you online or find out about
Parkendium.
Yeah. Find out about your project. Where should they go? Because I want to spread the word about it because I think it's super cool.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. So Parkendium.com, Parkendium.com, will take you to the public archive. My email address is jason@parkendium.com. I'm most active on Twitter right now. I don't know how much longer that will last, but I can be found there at Archivist Jason. And I post a lot of 25 years ago today at Disneyland photos. And we're now, when this podcast comes out, we'll be a week removed from it, but in 6 days from now is the anniversary of the new Tomorrowland of 1998's grand debut, and so I have a lot of photos and memories related to that you can look for there.
Well, awesome, yeah, those are really fun. Like I'm amazed when I look back. I'm like, that was actually 25 years. I can't believe that it's been that long. But those are really fun. I highly recommend what you're putting out there on Twitter and beyond. And hopefully that will still be a place that we can do that. But thank you so much, Jason. This has been great.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Jason for being on the show. It's really cool to get to focus so much on Disneyland and its history as we approach the big episode 200 that I think you're going to enjoy. It will be a trip report from my visit to Disneyland, which, as this podcast is being released, is happening right now. Can you believe it? So I can't wait to tell you all about that trip, and I will do it with the big episode 200. And surrounding episode 200, I am also making a push for 200 ratings on Apple Podcasts. We have a long way to go, but I would love it if you could go out there and submit a 5-star rating and possibly a review too. That would make a huge difference. This is your way. You can support the show by doing this. It only takes a few minutes. And if you leave a review, I will give you a shout out, of course, on the show. You can also support the show through Patreon and get access to some really cool perks by going to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety. Or you can buy me a Dole Whip, which I'm sure I will be doing as you're listening to this show. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip. You can make a one-time contribution there. The music you're hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey, performed by the Sophisticated Babies. If you want to get a hold of me, send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. I always love hearing from you. You can follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, Facebook, Instagram, Tomorrow Society, both of those. You can also go to the Tomorrow Society podcast channel on YouTube. Always great to hear from you that you're enjoying some of the home movies I played on there, and I'm hoping to shoot some footage at Disneyland that you will get the chance to see in the future. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it as always. It's been great to be able to continue to do this show as we roll into the summer of 2023. How are we already here? I don't know, but I'm excited and enjoying the ride. Looking forward to some of the shows that are upcoming, including my big trip report that will be out with the next episode. Really looking forward to it. Thanks so much. Talk to you again very soon.